All right, this chapter only gets better. We're moving into Learning Objective 4 when hopefully, as we began this chapter and we were talking about here are all the assumptions that need to take place in order for us to use cost, volume, profit analysis. Well, okay, we're accountants or we're business people. We should think critically. What happens if those assumptions change? What happens if those assumptions don't hold? Well, that's why we have sensitivity analysis. So we're going to look at the what if situations. What happens to my estimates of profit or loss or break even if those assumptions change? Okay, so for example, what happens if the sales price does change? The assumption was that we're always going to sell the product for the same price. The Smart Learning tab's always at 500. Well, what if competition in the industry is fierce and I need to be able to reduce my sales price from 500 to 475 per unit? What would that do to my break even? How many units would I need to be able to sell to break even if I drop my sales price from 500 to 475? Here's my what if scenario. Well, the fixed cost will not change as a result of changing our sales price. Our target profit at this point is just break even. What do I need to do to break even if I drop my sales price? So we have our fixed cost of $12,000 divided by contribution margin per unit. So instead of the 500 per unit that we had in the prior slide for break even, now we have 475. So our contribution margin before for break even would have been 225. Now it's 200. 475 minus 275. So fixed cost divided by my new contribution margin means that I'm going to have to sell 60 units to break even. And before, okay, on the break even slide, we were covering $12,000 of fixed cost with a contribution margin of 225. 500 minus 275, and we needed 53.3 units to break even. All right, here's a good note on rounding when you're doing cost, volume, profit analysis and break even. You always round up. We can't manufacture 53 and a portion of a product to sell and break even. So you always have to round up with cost, volume, profit when we're trying to determine the number of units that we need to sell, 54. So if we drop our price, instead of selling 54 units to break even, now I need to sell 60. Okay, but we need to think about this, and this is where those marketing people become very important for us in the business world. If I drop my price to 475, either because competition is fierce or because it is Black Friday or it's the day after Christmas sales, what will that do to my volume? Okay, so maybe it's not so hard. In this case, it's just 4 more items. But what if it's 400 or 4,000? Okay, what would the change in that sales price do to our potential ability to reach those 60 units or 60,000 units that we need to sell? Okay, so the sales price could change. What if, another item in our formula, what if the variable cost change? Your book says, what happens if one of my suppliers comes along and it increases the cost of those batteries? And so now if my variable costs have gone from 275 to 285, one of my suppliers has increased my materials price, what happens? Well, once again, we still got the same fixed cost that we need to cover. That hasn't changed. We're still trying to break even, so target profit is 0. We're going back to our original sales price of $500 per unit, but now my variable costs are $285 instead of $275 because the batteries went up $10 each. So at this particular situation, I would have to sell 56 units to break even. Okay, so once again, just 2 more than I would have had before. But once again, what if that's 20 or 200 or 2,000? We need to know how changing our variable cost could change our break even. What happens if a supplier offers to sell us product at a discounted price if we buy in bulk? Okay, well, what happens if I buy it in bulk and it decreases my cost per unit? Take into consideration your storage cost. How would that impact my break even? We can do that with this analysis. All right, one more. What happens if we change our fixed cost? So in your textbook it says, well, we're thinking about taking out these 3 banner ads online that would cost us $3,000. Well, that is a fixed cost because regardless of what I spend on the advertisement, or basically it doesn't matter how many units I produce or don't produce, or sell or don't sell. I've got $3,000 tied up in advertising expenses. Those are fixed cost. So now our $12,000 in fixed cost have become 15 because we're going to run these ads. So we've resorted back to our original sales price, our original variable cost, and if I take on the project of these banner ads, now I have to sell 67 units to break even instead of 54. So we have to think logically and critically as accountants. Every business decision that we make doesn't hinge around this one break-even number. We can't simply say, oh, that increases our break-even. We can't take on that additional expense. Okay, so I've asked the question, should we spend the extra $3,000 on the banner ads? Once again, let's go back to our marketing people and how important they are. We need them to be able to show us that if we can invest the additional fixed cost in these ads, we can potentially increase sales by X%. All right, so this side of it simply shows us what management needs to view and understand about, well, we have to sell at least X amount of units, just additional units, just to cover those costs. And how many more units would I have to sell to generate a certain target profit margin? We could plug that number in if we wanted. Okay, so once again, just some what-if scenarios and analysis that we could use to make decisions when the assumptions change. Sales cost increase or decrease, variable cost increase or decrease. Fixed cost can change. Okay, even though in most cases what we're talking about is a fixed cost within a relevant range stays the same. But in a given situation, that assumption could change. We could buy new machinery. We could pay for a $3,000 banner ad. So this table kind of gives you a good background to look back at in what happens to our contribution margin per unit and break even when some of those assumptions change. And obviously, if our sales price per unit goes up, our contribution margin increases. The more contribution margin we have, the less units we have to sell to break even. The opposite would happen if our sales price per unit decreases. Okay, if our variable cost per unit goes up, the batteries now cost more, then obviously our contribution margin goes down, and I'm going to have to sell more to break even. The opposite happens if the cost per unit were to decrease as a result of a bulk discount. But what about our total fixed cost? If the fixed costs do increase, notice that, let me back up, notice that it says there's no effect on contribution margin. What? Let's take another look. If fixed costs go up or down, there is no impact on contribution margin. Remember, contribution margin is sales less variable cost. So my contribution margin does not change, but the amount of contribution margin that I need to generate to cover my fixed cost does change. So if total fixed cost increase, I'm going to have to generate more contribution margin, which means more sales of more units to break even. Okay, go back and review this. A very good table to show you what those effects are. All right, in the next example, we'll take a look at how we use CVP analysis to do some other things in our organization, like calculate the margin of safety, operating leverage, and what happens if we have more than one product. We've looked at the most simplistic forms of cost volume profit analysis so far, so we'll look at a few more tools that will help us to make decisions in our business when we come back to Learning Objective 5.